Alright folks, this is lab number 2, exercise 3. Now in this exercise we're going to create a change notification. Now the way the change notification works when it comes to the Graph API, so it works like the following. Okay. Now the notification mechanism has to be a push mechanism. So the push mechanism describes that when you build a client, you will need to register your intention to be notified for a given change. Now we call that a subscription. Okay. As part of creating the subscription, you must provide what is the object and what type of event you would like to be notified of. Along with creating the subscription, your program must provide a callback location. Now that callback location is also commonly referred to as a webhook. Webhook is nothing more than a URL that's publicly callable. So once you indicate your interest, for example, I want to know whenever a user is added to my Azure AD, or whenever a OneNote notebook is created, or a file in OneDrive is deleted or updated. Now that would indicate my intention. Now, as part of creating my subscription, I will provide a URL, which when these events are detected on the Microsoft Graph API, so once these changes are detected, Microsoft performs a post to your callback webhook. Now, as soon as you create a subscription, Microsoft will send a validation event with a validation code. All you have to do is return a 200 along with the code that was given to you to acknowledge that this is the correct webhook and we are expecting a callback. All right, so here we're going to see a code, an MVC code, that when you hit the notification controller with an HTTP GET, it will perform the subscription registration. Now, because my computer is running behind a NAT firewall, I am going to use ngrok, which provides me an internet addressable URL, an HTTPS location. So when it posts to the HTTPS location, the ngrok will forward it to my local machine. So that allows the webhook to be callable publicly, and my application be able to receive the callback as well as the payload. And the payload should give me the information I'm interested in. All right, so let's take a look at how we construct this code. All right. So I'm going to set up my configuration. So it contains my app ID, my app secret. Now, if you recall from the previous lab exercise, we have granted user.readAll to this application. Okay. Now there is an app ID for this lab for a given tenant. Now you also need an ngrok URL. Now you can download from download ngrok, and when you run it, okay, once you start ngrok, it will give you a unique URL that will forward to localhost 5000. So the actual command that I used is ngrok http I want the port 5000 to be forwarded to me into this local machine. So I'll need to copy that and make sure that it's in my configuration since it changes. Now naturally, if you have better control over the network and you have a public IP, or you can run this off an Azure web app, then you wouldn't have to go through ngrok. Now for the sake of keeping this lab short, we're going to use ngrok to expose the public endpoint. Okay, so in the startup.cs, okay, we're going to read the myconfig from app settings.json. Okay, and we're going to have it injected whenever it's needed. So I'm going to add this to the dependency injection container. All right, so we're going to use it later on in our controller. Okay, we have to turn off HTTPS redirection, mainly because we need to accommodate the port 5000 in this example. Okay, so the very first place that we go to is in the notification controller. Now I'm going to start with the get, so you know what is happening here during the get request. So when you make a get request, we're going to take the config, inject it into the controller. Okay, we're going to spin up a graph client. Now, if you're wondering how this graph client is created, please refer to the previous lab exercises. This handles the delegating handlers. This handles getting the bears token into the authorization header. Okay, now we need to instantiate a subscription object. So this represents a subscription for a given change type. So we're looking for update changes. Okay, now the notification URL is the ngrok URL combined with the API of this controller, this API controller. Okay, so this will be posted back to whenever these changes are detected. Followed by the type of resource we're interested. We're interested in user objects, and this subscription will expire in 5 minutes time. The client state isn't being used in this demonstration, but you could include any piece of arbitrary data and then read them back when as part of the payload when the post is sent by the Graph API to your post method. All right, so here we created a subscription by using the graph service client .subscriptions .request, and we are going to add the definition of the sub. Okay, now the return of this add async is a new subscription object. Now we're going to stick that into an array based on the subscription ID. Now every time you do this get, you get a new subscription, and every subscription is reliably delivered to your post. All right, so here if we have a subscription timer, if we don't have a subscription timer yet, we're going to create a new instance of it. 5 seconds later, fires every 15 seconds. Okay, all right. Okay, so once you create this subscription, now we have to handle the post from our controller. So we handle our post. There are two things you need to handle. The first type is this. So before Microsoft start dispatching event back to this webhook callback URL, it's going to send a validation token. So this validation token will come in the form of query strings or query parameters. So we're going to look at the query parameters for a parameter called validation token. So if we can find it, we're going to simply return an OK along with the validation token that was sent to us. So essentially we do an echo back that acknowledges that this is the endpoint for that webhook. All right, now this, if it's not a validation token type of post, that means we're receiving a payload regarding the event we're interested in. So here we are going to stream reader, read them as a text. Okay, so we're going to read the entire thing as text to the end and then print them out in a JSON objects. Okay, so we're going to deserialize them as JSON object into notifications, which is just a data transfer object that we use to deserialize that notification. So each notification includes these various properties. Okay, the client state is deserialized into the notification objects. Okay, so that is the gist of the controller. Okay, so our post will take the payload, we'll print it out. Okay, all right. Now in the next part, I'll go through the check for updates. So let's run it for now to make sure it works as expected. All right, so we're going to do a run and start debugging. All right. So once the web server is up, we're gonna poke at HTTP localhost 5000. All right. So when we hit localhost 5000, you'll see a subscription ID being echoed back. Now, when you look at the code debug window, you'll see that it's going to continually checking for subscriptions. Okay. And if it's about to expire, that check subscription will renew that subscription. So to keep it going. Remember our expiration time is 5 minutes, so if you wait for about 3 minutes, once the remaining time is less than 2, it's going to perform a renew. So we're going to let that go for a minute. All right, so now we have the subscription. Let's see the post back give us the notification of the change. All right, so for that, I'm going to modify some user properties. Okay, so I'm going to select this user and perhaps edit something. Test underscore test. User underscore user. And I'm going to go ahead and save it. Now this is when we switch over to ngrok. Okay, just to see that. Notice we have just received an HTTP post against our endpoint. Now let's take a look at what that post entails. All right, so here's the data. All right, so we can see that we have received a update change. Okay. For that particular resource. And here's the resource ID for that user. All right, so now we know that there is a change. And we're going to loop through them and print out all of the users. All right. Okay. Let's make another change real quick. New title. New department. 8888. So now I'm going to make a change. Notice this time I'm changing job title, department, and employee ID. So now let's see what we get. Okay, so we got another post from the ngrok for the change we made. But what about the second post? That's quite interesting. So let's dig a little deeper why we have two posts. Okay. Now this is the fact that the user did change. And this is telling us that the user that had its property changed. Okay. Now this is the event. This is the validation token. Anytime that we have a new subscription registered, so that's a validation token. So now on the first request, we're going to retrieve the entire page of users. So you'll see that that first change notification contains every single user. Now in the subsequent request, we initialize the delta page variable right here. Delta link, sorry. In the delta link variable on the subsequent request, when we call the get user, we will retrieve only the user that has changed on the second request. All right, so in this code, you see how we can create a subscription, how to provide a callback for the Graph API to return the payload to the post endpoint, echo back the validation token, as well as using the delta change in order to fetch only those items that changed since the last fetch. Okay, so in other words, every time we fetch something, at the end of all the pages, let's say it's 10 page of 50 users, so it's 500 users. At the last page, there will be a delta link. So with that delta link on the request, on the subsequent request, all we are going to get is the differences between the last request and this request. So that's what the delta link at the last page let us do, fetching only those changed records.